Thank you all for joining and participating today.
Thank you for setting up too.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is we're really trying to get this initiative going. And this semester we got a lot more applications than we have in the last 2 semesters. So we're glad that it's picking up speed. We were a little bit worried last semester. We got very few applications and we were
Wow.
worried people were interested. So we were glad that we got more this semester. So as I suppose you all know, it's open. So we had a few people sign up, but oftentimes they sign up and then don't actually show up. So I'm not sure how many people will actually end up tuning in, and then some people tune in a little bit late. But since it's time, we can go ahead and get started. So thank you all again so much for participating, and especially to Michael for sharing his paper with us. And so as I send in the email to the core participants, we will start with Michael giving us, I don't know, a few minutes, just, 2 or 3 on the paper. You don't have to summarize it for us. We all had access to it and all read it. So just some background on it and maybe what your goals are for the paper so that we can, tailor our feedback for you for your personal goals for the paper. And then Patience and then Brandon will give their 10 to 15 minutes of comments on the paper, and then we'll go ahead and open up the discussion so Michael can respond to comments if he likes, and other participants are
I know you all had access to the paper, so Michael, just give us like a 2 minutes.
So can you chat in?
So Michael, you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure.
Great.
All right. So thank you so much again for setting up this, and Patience, thank you so much, and Brandon for accepting to share feedbacks with me. So this research was initiated from my doctoral thesis. I had to work on the conflicts in the northern part of Nigeria between farmers and cattle rearers. So I spent about a month in the north and trying to conduct interviews, trying to conduct focus group discussions, talking with law enforcement officers, talking with the village chiefs, talking with the farmers themselves, with the herders, in focus group discussions, and trying to find out exactly what the issues are, why these conflicts continue to go on unabated. And I came up with some findings, which of course I published, I wrote as my dissertation. But it is obvious that in the last few months, there seems to be certain trends that are emerging in those conflicts. And so I'm trying to see how I can branch off, from the core of my research, which of course try to study the original, causes of the challenge, to the emerging trends that are noticeable in the crisis. All right, and so that's how I came up with this research idea. So basically, the major reasons for the conflict, as I observed in my research, was access to resources. All right, access to land, access to water resources for the cattle to drink, grazing field for the cattle to graze. So the competition between farmers and cattle rearers for these resources that are scarce now was the major cause of the crisis between these farmers. Even though some of them alluded to religion, to ethnicity, to politics, as complicating the issues, but the major core of the problem were these competitions for resources. But increasingly, it's obvious that there seems to be some terrorist dimension to it. All right, there have been assertions by law enforcement officers. There have been assertions by public officers themselves. Ministers, even governors. There have been assertions also in the media that seem to show that there's evidence that some of these headers, or these alleged headers, might actually be Boko Haram terrorists, members, or people who are migrants from other countries, who come to terrorize the communities, who come terrorizing the residents and all of that. So it seems as if there's an emerging trend an emerging trend of terrorism, coloring the conflicts. And so that's one interesting side to it. And I also tried to interrogate the political aspect, all right? The fact that our incumbent president in Nigeria declared his assets, and of course we could see that he also is a herdsman, and of course he has a group of heads, he has a farmland, he has a ranch, and all of that, So perhaps there's also an explanation of interest, and influence that him being a header has on the influence, and the courage, and perhaps giving the impetus for headers to continue the violence that they perpetrate in many parts of the northern part of Nigeria. So those are some of the issues I tried to emphasize in the paper. All right, and I'm hoping actually to publish this in perhaps the Security Review Journal, or any other journal that focuses on African security, or humanitarian issues with regards to Africa specifically. All right, so I just wanted to know what your thoughts are, what areas I could make improvement on, to get it published, particularly maybe with theory and methods, and things like that.
Great, thanks, Michael. So why don't we go ahead and start with Patience and hear your comments.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, sure, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay, so I read through the paper, and I have a few comments that I think that you need the document didn't come out very clearly.
Okay.
What the main goal of the paper was. Okay, yeah, so I really think that there are quite a number of issues that you took along, and as you went on, you left what the specific goal of the paper was, what the central argument was that it is you were trying to present in this particular paper, because I think that every paper has a central argument or a central thing that it come through so that it's clear what the paper is trying to talk about. Now, in the introduction, that the introduction is where you should have spent time telling us about the different conflicts that there are in Nigeria, and then narrowing it down specifically to the conflict it focuses on. And then when you move on to step it down to the conflicts between farmers and herders, specifically in that particular section is where I think that you would have tried to trace the trajectory of the conflicts between farmers and herders, because these conflicts have been there for a very long time. And when you look at the historical accounts, many years back, the farmers and herders in Nigeria cohabited peacefully.
Mm-hmm.
There were skirmishes, but they were resolved through traditional mechanisms, either by the local traditional authority and things like that. Some of the things that we've noticed now, increase in the casualties, sophisticated weapons being used, and things like that. So the dimension of the conflict kind of changed. So I thought that it would have been good if you had spent time tracing the trajectory of the conflicts have changed in the way in which you're trying to present them now. I thought that was lacking for other readers who might not necessarily be very conversant with the conflicts in Nigeria. That historical account leading up to the current events was actually missing to tell a complete story of what is actually going on. Yeah, so then most of my comments are going to be based on the paper and not based on the presentation you've made now. Okay, so back and forth, talking about the conflicts between farmers and herders, and also talking about the conflicts in the Niger Delta. So there was some form of confusion. At some point, it felt like I was reading about the causes of the conflicts between farmers and herders, and then next paragraph, you mentioned Niger Delta. So I think the back and forth should go, else it will create some form of confusion for whoever is. If they talk about the conflict in the area, I think that the major focus should now be the conflicts between. So it is clear from that point on that all that you're talking about relates to the conflicts between farmers and herders. Yes. Then Electrical Foundation, which talks about relative deprivation.
Yeah.
But yes, again, I thought that you should have linked it very well because it was not clear. You alluded to the fact that the herdsmen have been deprived. They've suffered prolonged deprivation, but you did not go ahead to tell us the manifestations of these deprivations. How have they suffered deprivation? At that point, it wasn't particularly clear to me how applicable the relative deprivation theory was to this argument. Now, remember that you have said that the issues are complex, they are hydra-headed, and so on and so forth. So I would not imagine that probably a single theory might explain all that is going on. You might have to use a combination of theories in this regard. But I don't have any suggestions to offer on the theoretical foundations at the moment. But I think after the discussions, I can still check my notes and see if I can offer any useful suggestions on theoretical foundations that might be helpful. Now, when you talk about the headers suffering, it seems for me at point that the discussion is lopsided. What about the farmers? Are they not encountering or facing any form of deprivation? Because the picture you presented is that the headers are the ones facing the deprivation, and the conflicts are now a resultant effect of the deprivation that they are suffering. I think that you need to present a balanced argument if at all you're going to use this theory in making your arguments. So what do the headers think that they deserve, and what have they gotten that has not met their expectations, so that we understand the level of deprivation that you're talking about. One about the views in certain states in Nigeria, and I have also worked on the conflicts between farmers and herders in Nigeria. So I was wondering why you chose Kaduna, Nasarawa, and Benue, because when you no, not Benue, Kaduna, Nasarawa, and Plateau.
Plateau, yeah.
Because yes, when you look at the prevalence, the conflicts and the areas where these conflicts are more prevalent, then Benue would have been a better option. Benue or Taraba would have been a better option to Nasarawa. Okay. So yeah, I on why those 3 states out of the 36 states in the country were chosen would have cleared that doubt completely. Then you interviewed certain people. You had focus group discussions with them as well, but I couldn't see how you interrogated the data that you generated from the field. Okay, Michael. Yes, so you have a section where you discuss interviewing farmers and interviewing headers as well, and security experts, community leaders, having discussions with these categories of people. And then the next section in your paper talks about the causes of the farmer-header conflicts. And I was expecting to see you discuss the data that you had gathered from these people. What have they said are the causes of these conflicts in their areas? Interestingly, you began to review what other people have said. That is, you began to review what the literature has said about these conflicts rather than presenting what data you have generated from the field. And it went through the paper right to the end. I would have loved to see what the people have said, because when you interrogate these conflicts in Nigeria, like I said, I've worked on some states, the drivers of the conflict seem to be different in the different states.
Mm-hmm.
So when you put it on a scale in one state, what you would find of the scale in another state. So I really expected to see if there were those kinds of variations in the three states that you were interrogating. But like I said, I didn't see very much of you reporting what the interviews and the focus group discussions had generated. And I really expected that to be paper. Then one last comment, so I'll allow others to speak as well, is the terrorist dimension of the conflict. And in your paper, you said it's a speculation. So I was actually wondering why you should promote that speculation. If you wanted to strengthen the argument by finding empirical justification for it, I think that would have been better. That would have added a lot more knowledge and substance to the speculation. But you did not interrogate that part in the field based on what I read.
Mm-hmm.
So I wouldn't really think that it is right. I don't really think that it is right for you to promote the speculation. If there is empirical justification or the interviews have substantiated these claims, then I think that you should be presenting those substantiated claims. Yes, you should present aspects of the interviews that substantiate these claims, and then so we can move from the realm of speculation to actually understanding if this is it. Now, the Global Terrorism Index, I think, in 2015 ranked the Fulani militia as one of the fifth deadliest groups in the world. Yes, in the world. So there's Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, ISIS, and the others, and then there is the Fulani militia. Yes, so that is just, I think that has been the one piece of literature that everyone has provided the evidence to substantiate some of these claims on terrorism and to bring out the links between what is happening with the Fulani herdsmen and Boko Haram. So if you cannot substantiate it, I don't think that it will be good for us to continue these speculations. So there are a few other comments, but while you think about them, I'll allow others to also speak, and then the discussion can continue. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Great. Okay, we will turn it quickly over to Brandon, and then I know there was a lot to unpack there, Michael, but just hold your horses, and you can respond to Brandon and Patience together.
All right.
Yeah, well, so I'm Brandon. So you don't know me, Michael, but I've worked in Nigeria since 2005. I've written 2 books about
Yeah.
northern Nigerian politics, and a lot of articles. And I think more importantly and germanely to this particular issue, I'm more or less your modal reviewer when you send this to an international journal. I review 25 articles a year about Nigerian politics, and so understand that when I give you the comments I'm giving you, this is likely what you are going to get back if you try to publish this in a journal outside of Nigeria. And a lot of what I'm going to say is going to sound similar to what Patience says. I think that if you want to publish this in an academic journal outside of Nigeria, you have a lot of work to do in terms of reframing and restructuring the paper so that it meets not just the quality standards, but the expectations that those readers are likely to have. Just sort of broadly, as somebody who's read 200 academic articles written by Nigerians that they've sent to journals in the last decade, I do find that consistently Nigerian authors often, I think, aren't sort of understanding what the audience is for that sort of thing. The people who read articles about Nigerian politics know a lot about Nigerian politics. It is useful to get right into the details and the specifics of your case and not spend a lot of time and space sort of with preamble. You don't do the things that half of the papers I read about Nigerian politics start with, in the amalgamation of 1914. We know that, right? I do this for a living full time. You don't need to sort of give me all of the background, right? And that's important, and you're going to hear that from journal editors. The people who are interested in this topic know this topic. And so the question is going to be, what are you doing new for us theoretically and empirically? So it's a different readership than I think a lot of people have in mind. And I have sort of 3 sets of comments that I'll make, and they're going to echo what Patience said already. The first, again, has to do with audience and journal editors. In a lot of ways, what you've written here is a policy memo, and that's not, for the most part, what academic journals publish, right? The set of recommendations that you make at the end are interesting, but they're entirely unmoored from your analysis, right? None of the empirical evidence that you present is directly linked to those recommendations. Those recommendations have been essentially pulled from thin air. They're not bad recommendations, I don't think, but they're not original to you or original to your data. And so somebody's going to bring that up when this goes to a reviewer. More broadly, very few journals are going to publish a paper where the main takeaways are policy recommendations. And so I think that you have to think about reframing this paper, if your goal is to publish it in an academic journal, in terms of the contributions that you make, either with new empirical evidence or with a test of a proposition with new data, right? So what would it look like to do that? Patience brought up Why Men Rebel and Gur. The literature on rebellion is not my literature, but I do know that Gur is in a lot of ways been superseded by other more contemporary theorizings. There's not a broad contemporary literature that views relative deprivation as the primary driver of participation in violence. And that's something I think that you have to acknowledge and explore. But even if you want to talk about Gur and you want to start with Gur, to be blunt here, I mean, essentially what you do is you use Gur as a way to justify a set of assumptions about the motives of Fulani herders, rather than using it as a way to sort of think through empirically what we might expect to see versus what seems to actually be happening. Or more importantly, given the data that you have, what we would expect to see versus what people think is happening. Because you don't have data about what is happening, you have data about what people think is happening. And that's really important. We're going to come to that in a second. More importantly, and again, this is a strategic thing as a reviewer of lots of articles by Nigerians, you engage almost exclusively with papers written in Nigeria by Nigerians. For empirical stuff, this is good, but when you're trying to publish with an internationally oriented journal, you're going to get questions, sort of why haven't you engaged more broadly and more generally with the academic literature on the question of participation in violence beyond Gur? And so I think that you're going to have to think about broadening out the literature that you're citing. And think about how to cite it not just as sort of evidence of the assumptions that you want to make, but in terms of developing a story about how this is how we think as scholars about why violence happens, like this kind of violence, right? Why violence around land use or access to land, for example, happens. This is why I think Nigeria either is an illustrative case that suggests the literature is on the right track, or this is how I think it's not on the right track, and this is how I'm going to use Nigeria to think through that, right? I would echo very strongly, and this is my second point, the comment that Patience makes, that in effect, you've collected this potentially really interesting data and then not presented it at all in this paper. Other than the couple of quotes from police officers, really none of the data that you've presented is present or used in the analysis. And that's a shame, right? When reviewers are reading papers like this, they're very much looking for, if there's not a lot new theoretically, they at least want to see what's new in terms of the empirics, right? What is somebody who works on Nigeria full-time not going to know? And the voices of participants in and around the edges of this conflict are things that we don't have, right? So that's potentially new and useful, but you don't give us any of that, right? You are 100% going to hear that from a reviewer when you send this out. They're going to say, where is the data? What are you actually doing with it? So when we think about comments on methods, the problem is not that you've necessarily deployed the wrong methods. The problem is that you've promised us one thing and then delivered an entirely different thing, right? You've not used the promise of that data to guide your analysis directly. More importantly, and I think this gets again to something that Patience brought up and that I'm going to talk about more in a second, what you have collected in essence is data about the attitudes, beliefs, and opinions of people who participate in and around this conflict, right? You've interviewed people who have different kinds of levels of experience with it, people who have different backgrounds and presuppositions. And you need to understand that you have not collected data about the causes of the conflict, right? You have not engaged in a methodological project that allows you to say things like, this is what's causing the conflict. What you have is data about what people think are going on, right? Their kind of imaginations about what the conflict is like, about their engagements with other participants in and around the conflict. And I really think that the paper would be best if it was framed in those terms. Here is some original data about what people who live in states impacted by these conflicts and who have professions that are impacted by these conflicts think is going on, right? And in particular, to draw some interesting comparisons between the way that people on the ground are talking about the conflict and the way that elites, policy analyses, and governments are talking about the conflict, right? The way that you have presented this is different from the way that the Nigerian state talks about it, the way that the Nigerian military talks about it, the way that international organizations like Crisis Group talk about it, and different from the ways that kind of specialists in extremist violence have talked about it. This is useful to say, hey, this is how people on the ground are conceptualizing this conflict. That's a meaningful and useful contribution, but to present it in those terms.
Yeah.
Now, the third thing, and I was sort of hoping I wouldn't have to say it in this way, but since Patience broached it and you kind of talked about it in your presentation too, you're engaging in conspiracy theorizing here, right? In a lot of really important ways. You're presenting things that we don't have evidence for. In ways that make them look like facts, and they're not. You didn't collect the kind of data that will allow us to make claims like this is really terrorism, or that it's really linked to Boko Haram or the Islamic State. There is a way to collect that information, but that's not what you did, right? You would have to be interviewing participants in the violence, right? You would have to be looking at communications between members of extremist organizations, and that's not what you have. What you have are the views of people who are on the periphery of the conflict and what they think is going on. That's useful and important. It's useful to know that people who are around the conflict think that this is what's happening, because it shapes their actions, it shapes what they advocate for, it shapes what they want from government. That's great. But I was in Kano in November talking about how widespread these conspiracy theories are and how they shape the political responses to the conflict. That's useful and that's a good thing to have, but both with the Boko Haram stuff and especially with the stuff about Buhari himself being an ethnic Fulani and the fact that he owns, you do not have evidence to make the kinds of claims that you seem to be advancing here, right? And this isn't just from me. When this gets to a reviewer, this is what they're going to tell you. It could be that you want to advocate for that and you want to make those claims anyway, but it will be hard to find an academic outlet that wants to publish it. I don't think it's what you should be doing, but if that's what you want to do, you're going to have a hard time. I would really strongly recommend that you remove that framing or that you present direct evidence of it. I don't think that evidence exists, but if you have it, let us see it. Instead, I would really strongly urge that you reformulate the paper around the voices of the people who you've talked to, and emphasize that now we know what people who are around the conflict are saying and thinking. Here are the consequences of the ways in which they're conceptualizing and framing the conflict. So those are my recommendations.
All right, thank you so much.
Great, thanks, Brandon. And Michael, do you want to respond? Do you have things you want to say?
Yeah, of course, first of all, I just want to thank Patience and Brandon for very, very in-depth, very in-depth comments and suggestions. Perhaps I'll just make a comment. Of course, I've noted most of all of the things you said, particularly to the structure of the paper, with regards to the evidence for the terrorist dimensions and all of those, and I would look to to modifying to reflect most of your comments. But I was just going to make a comment on the selection of the states, which Patience made allusion to. Of course, it's obvious that there are evidences, of many of the states in the north, right? And of course, the states of Taraba, the states of Benue are also one of those very prominent states. But this research I conducted in 2017, and it was not very easy to cover as many states as possible. So I tried to pick states where I had sufficient information that this conflict existed, and of course local governments where they were also very prominent. So it was not all local governments in the states that I conducted research in. I had to narrow down to some specific local governments where there were evidences of widespread conflicts of this nature, and that's why I stuck with those 3 states. But perhaps I'll also for the future, maybe I'll have to extend the search to other states as I work more on this issue. And again, about the issue of speculation, and not promoting speculations, I agree, and I agree also that there is no evidence to buttress the issue or the claim for terrorism. And maybe I shouldn't be going that route, but I mean that seems to be the manifestation. That seems to be what is going on, But perhaps since there's no evidence, maybe I'll just take a pause, on that regard.
I think it's useful to ask why you think that's what's going on. Like, and what evidence do you have that that's what's going on, right? Is that what, I mean, it's interesting that, for example, security agents are talking about it in those terms, but the information that you provide, the quotes from security agents, it's not like they're sort of, I mean, they themselves appear to be engaged in politically motivated speculation. Yeah. That's okay. That's good to know that Nigerian police officers are engaged in, motivated speculation about what's happening. But when you think about what that evidence would actually look like, right? Because if you look at the way that scholarship on Boko Haram has evolved, increasingly there is sort of concrete and specific evidence about the motivations of participants, the ways in which they become involved in the conflict. But this is evidence that has to be gathered in a particular way. In interviewing a non-random sample of people who are not immediate participants in the violence is not a way that you can possibly methodologically get that information, right? And so it's just, I mean, I'm not saying that you're wrong. I'm just saying that you've not produced evidence.
I understand evidence, right? Evidence to back up the claim. I understand, and unfortunately, that evidence is not there. Well, perhaps I'll just leave it at that. And I don't know, but your comments have been very useful anyway. Thank you so much.
I really agreed I agreed a lot with what Patience and Brandon had to say in general, but in Brandon's talking about the evidence that, first of all, that we don't get to see the evidence. And it's, you really, you make it sound like you spent this time doing the field work, talking to all these people. And then, as they said, both Patience and Brandon said, we don't really get to see it. So definitely, no matter what happens, make sure that you enter some more of the quotes and things that you learned while you were on the ground. But one way to build on this idea of what you have collected are thoughts the thoughts and beliefs of sort of people on the ground is to maybe reframe the paper in terms of, well, I spoke with focus groups of herders, and they saw the sort of source of the conflict as being about either relative deprivation, or they saw it as a scarcity of resources. And, over and over again, I heard about how there's just not enough resources. But then I did focus groups with farmers, and they really saw the sort of basis of conflict to be, I don't know, something to do with Boko Haram or something, or they saw it in terms of ethnic tensions or cultural differences between groups. And then I talked to security forces that actually deal with trying to stop this violence, and they see it as something else. And that in order to sort of motivate this paper, you might talk about how we have these theories that explain conflict, and I'm sort of agnostic objectively about what is causing the conflict, but to say that the different participants in this conflict see the foundations of it completely differently. And I think that would be a really interesting sort of interjection to say that they're, like the people who are specifically affected by all of this violence see the causes completely differently, which means that if we're going to end the violence, then, we have to address all of these different factors for different groups of people. So that might be one way to think about it, especially because that's sort of the core evidence that you seem to have collected, and that you might be able to employ that effectively in that way.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think you're right. You're right. I'll go back and restructure the paper and make use of all these useful comments that have been made and see what I can do and get from
And
that.
I think as probably the person in this conversation that has the least background on this conflict, I would also say that you might upfront give a better sense of what this violence actually looks like. You give sort of broad numbers and statistics, rankings about how severe the violence is, but I don't really have a great sense of, what is happening. Is it just that there's the cattle eats farmers' crops, and then sort of two people are arguing with one another, and is this just sort of blood vengeance, or are these whole communities fighting with one another? What exactly does the violence look like? And then I think that this connects to the point about Boko Haram, is that I think we've talked about these claims as being unsubstantiated, but as somebody that doesn't study this, I don't even have any idea, after reading this paper, what it would even look like for these to be Boko Haram attacks. How would you know if these, I don't even, I can't even tell you what evidence it would, is it just that Boko Haram is giving the Fulanis, money to buy guns, or they're just supplying them with guns, or are they, are their motivations different? Are the herders not attacking people because of cattle herds, but because of political, or I don't even so I just want to say that if you're going to keep the Boko Haram angle, you should at the very least explain how that would even look like, even if you're not going to, I agree that you shouldn't argue that that's what's happening, but it's a viewpoint. But if you're going to keep it as a viewpoint, as the way that the participants are sort of seeing this conflict, you should at least explain what that even means, because it's unclear to me what these two groups have in common at all. So just as sort of from a perspective of somebody that doesn't know anything about this conflict.
Because the main evidence that you bring forward there is the sort of thing about the AK-47s. Now, I don't know how carefully you watch sort of Nigerian military Facebook and Twitter, but a lot of the interventions that they make capturing weapons involve Dane guns, right?
Yeah.
It's not clear that having AK-47s is evidence that Boko Haram is involved. AK-47s are not unavailable in the West African context. And so to talk about sort of, because you have this rich data, what mental pathway are people walking in order to make that claim, right? When a police officer sits down and says, I think that Boko Haram is involved in this, well, this is the kind of evidence that I'm presenting. This is why I think this. And to sort of explore what that looks like is really interesting, because what security agents think about this conflict motivates how they act, how they treat the different participants in it, what they ask for from the federal government. That's really useful information, and there's been some research about that in the context of Boko Haram, right? The way that the Nigerian military flattens the distinction between different kinds of groups and participants in the conflict, calls everybody a Boko Haram terrorist, right? And what that does for them politically then is really interesting, right? So to think about framing what you're doing in those terms, I think is really helpful. I also, just because Patience brought it up, so I know the people who do the START data, that claim about Fulani militias being the fifth biggest terrorist group in the world comes from.
Yeah.
And I've had conversations about their methodology. And like, it is important to understand that they are not sort of engaged in a careful parsing project where they're really sort of able to say, oh, this is what the background of this is. They are simply recording newspaper article death tolls, essentially. And because the death tolls were high enough, they sort of made this kind of very simplistic methodological claim that these groups are together. When they call them Fulani militias, they're not basing that on participant observation research that shows that, in fact, those groups are organized as militias or that they recruit in the way that militias do. They wouldn't even say that about it, right? And so you can't take what they're providing as evidence and extrapolate anything other than collectively this conflict has produced a lot of deaths. And they'll tell you that if you ask them.
Interesting.
They have done no on-the-ground research about the organization of violence in northern Nigeria.
Yeah. Wow. All right. I guess I'm grateful for all the comments. Right. I mean, this has been quite more than I expected. Thank you so much.
Patience or Catlin, do you have anything else to add? I can't.
Okay, no, all I'm going to say is that he needs to toe the path that Brandon had spelled out by focusing more on what the groups are saying. So, and it's true, I agree with Brandon that when you interview the farmers in the states, in the different states, you get very different viewpoints of what they think are the drivers of the conflict. When you interview the headers, what you hear is also quite different from what the farmers are saying in the same state. So it's good for you to amplify these voices for the readers to see what the people who are actually experiencing these conflicts, what they think are the drivers of these conflicts. And I think that will make a better contribution than focusing on the very different issues that you're trying to bring on, and then trying to focus on the consequences and the effects and some of those things. I don't think that is a good enough part. I think that should form the background where you're trying to explain the nature of the conflict and the effects. Else, when you bring it out as a core objective and what you've presented, you're more or less restating the obvious. And there is nothing new generated or added to the body of knowledge. So I think that it's better for you to stick to the areas in which you would make a more meaningful contribution to the subject matter.
So
Thank you
can
so
you
much.
guys hear me now?
Yeah, sure.
Yes,
Oh,
we can.
great. I'll just make one last comment. So I echo and second everything Patience and Brandon said. They made some really great comments. I think the one thing I was thinking about is how perhaps it's not great thinking of the Fulani militia / herder / sort of that group as a monolithic group. And this sort of speaks to what Patience was saying and with respect to there's different reasons and different motivations across states, but I think even within states across different LGAs, the Fulani herdsmen or Fulani, like the Fulani is not necessarily a monolithic group that all sort of is motivated by the same thing. And so while you might be getting these perceptions in certain areas about connections to certain groups, Boko Haram or the security forces, maybe just keep an eye out in terms of maybe the differences or variations of motivations even within the Fulani. And that also might be able to add something. It's like a place where you can add where there's a bit more nuance to this conflict than has been talked about before, and particularly the narrative that is circulating in the media.
Yeah.
But it's great. Thanks for letting me join.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you.
Any last questions, thoughts, or comments?
Well, not exactly. Just to thank everyone for finding time to go through my papers, especially Patience, Brendan. Your comments were very, very useful. Brendan, you actually brought out a whole new dimension to the paper, and I think I would stick to most of the things you have suggested. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Great. Thank you guys all so much again for participating. And make sure you spread the word to any graduate students or other scholars who might benefit from the colloquium, because we'll continue to have calls into the future for this. So thank you guys so much.
And just to say that I'll be reaching out to Patience and Brendan in the future on working towards the paper.
Sure.
If you have further comments and suggestions, I would really appreciate that too. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, guys. Okay. Have a good afternoon, day, or evening, depending on where you are.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thanks,
guys.
Natalie.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.